Excellent. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and jump in. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kathleen Stacks. I am one of the co-chairs of the Pathways Initiative Launch Committee along with Pam Sporborg. And we are excited to share this big proposal with you, walk through it in pretty big details, and answer your questions as we prepare for receiving your input and feedback. This is a really important part of this work that we're moving forward with a lot of input. So we're excited to see so much interest and look forward to receiving your comments. Pam, did you want to say any opening remarks? And then we'll walk through the agenda. Pam? Okay, I will just walk through the agenda. Pam, did you want to say anything to welcome everybody?
I think she might be having audio.
Gotcha. Well, we can walk through the agenda real quickly.
She might she's muted.
And then, so we go to the next slide for me, please, Sarah. Excellent. So we have a pretty robust agenda that we sent out yesterday. We're going to walk through some of the background and high-level overview of the Pathways Initiative, hear from some of the regulators who wrote the original letter and have been participating along the way, do a deep dive into the legal analysis and the step 1 and step 2 proposals, talk a little bit about what's different about this effort than previous regionalization conversations that we've had in the West, talk a bit about the California legislative process, and at that point we're going to pause and take questions from everyone. If you have questions in the meantime, please do put them in the chat. We'll check in before we get into the details of the before we get into the details of
muted. You can mute or unmute yourself by pressing.
Sorry, Pam. We'll do a pause after we hear from the regulators. If there's enough questions in the chat at that point, we'll address them then. Otherwise, we will take a good amount of time to take your questions after we walk through the proposal, and we'll hit all the ones that are in the chat along the way. We are also, I will just sort of call on people as we go, since we have so many different speakers today and covering so many different topics. So hopefully we'll have this run pretty smoothly. And with that, go to the next slide. We'll start with a bit of an overview of the Pathways Initiative. Next slide. These are more reminders for me of where we're breaking and switching over topics. But just as a reminder, last July, this Pathways Initiative was really kicked off by a letter from regulators in 5 states, Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, and New Mexico, that laid out a vision of ensuring that the benefits of wholesale electricity markets are maximized for customers across the Western United States. To do that, they proposed a handful of different sort of elements for the Pathways Initiative effort to consider, including having a West-wide footprint, including California, a separate nonprofit entity that is governed independently, being able to provide a full range of regional transmission operator services, building on the EIM and EDAM, avoiding duplication of investments and expenses of market infrastructure that have already been created, and avoiding a deterioration of benefits. And so the launch committee really took that letter, and you will see these elements reflected in the evaluation criteria, in the options that we've developed and put into this proposal. But just wanted to sort of remind everyone where we started. Next slide, please. With that, we developed a mission statement. This is available on the the Pathways Initiative landing page. I'm not going to read all the words on here, but you can see in bold some of the highlighted elements that do again reflect those original that original direction from the regulators in the July letter. Next slide, please. I also thought it'd be helpful to talk for a second about what the Pathways Initiative is and what it is not. There's so much going on in the West right now, and this is actually a pretty narrowly focused effort. We are focused solely on governance. The proposal reflects some incremental steps, which really builds on the way the West has approached market development thus far. It is stakeholder driven, including being funded by a diverse set of stakeholders, and we are collectively committed to the vision of the regulators from that July 23 letter. The Pathways is not working on market design. We are not proposing changes to any market design, and so this is not a conversation about any of the details that would be reflected in what a market design might look like. We're proposing to enable a construct that is independently governed that will manage changes to market design in the future, but that is not within the scope of what we're working on today. The launch committee is not doing any lobbying either. It's a really important, I think, distinction here as we get to a point where we're having conversations about what legislative change might be needed. Those will not be done by the launch committee as a whole. Certainly, plenty of the individual members will be engaged in those conversations, but it will not be a launch committee lobbying effort. And the last thing the Pathways Initiative is exclusive. We are, this launch committee was formed voluntarily upon recommendation from people that got together after the letter came out last fall. This is a group of people that raised their hands to really tackle the work piece. And then we have really been committed to ensuring transparency about the work that we're doing and providing ample opportunities for stakeholder input to this point. And as we look forward into the future about what we want, what work we still need to do, the engagement with stakeholders and the opportunity to hear from anyone and everyone is something we are very committed to. Next slide, please. And finally, the Pathways Initiative priorities that we have moving forward. Funding is still certainly an issue. I wanted to take a moment to address the DOE funding. As you have likely heard by this point, the Pathways Initiative Launch Committee did not receive DOE funding. We had applied for $800,000 from the Department of Energy earlier this year to fund the development and implementation of a stakeholder engagement process. The feedback we got from the Department of Energy was that they did not select our project primarily for a lack of known details about the scope of the funded activities. Back in January, we were still very early in our work, and it was difficult to provide details at that point about the direction and the ultimate structure that we're still, frankly, working to develop with input from stakeholders. We are committed still to developing and implementing a robust stakeholder engagement process, including a robust states committee structure for this future regional organization. And we're going to continue to work on that with more organic means. Our funding assumptions for the launch committee on this first phase did not assume that DOE funding would be available. And thus far, our work in phase one has been funded completely using stakeholder funding. There is another round of funding that the DOE is putting out for wholesale electricity market studies and engagements this spring. And so the launch committee is evaluating potential proposals for that funding opportunity and how beneficial those funds would actually be. We're also pursuing other funding opportunities, and we'll continue to provide information about the budget and the various tasks that we need to be able to fund, and how much money and where that money is coming from. So we are still committed to a transparent funding process as we move forward. as we look ahead, some of the things that we know we're going to need to put some time and effort into include a cost evaluation for the work that we're doing, particularly for step 2, and potentially additional legal analysis as we refine this proposal. So those are really still our primary priorities here from a work standpoint as we get through phase 1 and into phase 2. But we're feeling very optimistic about where we are today, and are excited about the progress that we're making. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Pam to talk a little bit about the details of what we've done so far.
Thank you, Kathleen. Can you hear me? I've been having a little audio challenge with my computer, so I had to call in from my phone. So I'm glad this is working. So I want to talk through just the enormous amount of work that the launch committee has done since the letter came out in July of 2023. And I first want to acknowledge just how much effort each member of the launch committee has put into this project. And it really has been a really wonderful opportunity to collaborate across this really diverse group of individuals across these different sectors, and to really see a kind of coalition that has not really been built before in the West come together to really find where we have consensus and how do we move forward on governance through a pathway that we have not yet contemplated. So since the letter came out in July of 2023, we first received comments on that regulator letter, and then worked to form the launch committee in the October timeframe. We also then issued in December our initial options and evaluation criteria and took stakeholder feedback through January on those comments. Since then, we have spent quite a bit of time in heads down work, reporting out to all of you on a monthly basis, but really spending a lot of time rolling up our sleeves to evaluate each of the options that we presented and their viability to move forward. In April, we just released the straw proposal, which we will go into more detail here today. And we are currently taking comments on that straw proposal through May. We're very excited to have produced this amount of work in this very short amount of time. And I think we can go to the next slide to talk about how we organized ourselves to get that done. So we formed 3 primary working groups that included various members of the launch committee. The first working group was the priority administration working group. That group developed the budget. We formed a contract with Global Impact so that we could actually collect funds from stakeholders to continue to support this work. We secured project management support with RAP and then with Utilicast. And we concluded fundraising to fund our efforts through this initial phase. We also created the communications and outreach work group so that we could form the sector updates that I hope you all have been receiving on a regular basis. The communications and outreach group also was the primary point of contact for stakeholder comments. And we've developed several sets of FAQs that are posted to the WEAB website, as well as the various talking points that we could use as the launch committee to communicate about our work cohesively around the region and to various stakeholders, and the various stakeholder materials, including what you're seeing here today. And the last group that I want to talk about was the priority functions and scoping group. And this is the group that really rolled up their sleeves to develop the straw proposal and work on the evaluation criteria for that straw proposal and the legal analysis, and has been, I think, one of the primary worker groups since we got our organizational scope together. The priority and functions working group has been digging into the various considerations around current options and the path forward for our proposal. On the next slide, we also established these evaluation criteria. I believe these have been public for quite a while, and we've taken comments on them. I'm not going to read them all here today, but essentially these criteria have really evolved to look at to reflect the input from the initial regulator letter, so that we could then evaluate these different proposals or options that we were considering through this maximization of net benefits, as well as really looking at the respect for state authority around procurement, environmental reliability, and other public interests. These are the kinds of criteria that, through our stakeholder feedback and our work through each sector, really became the focus of how we would evaluate each of our options and create the ability to create the recommendations that we have issued this month, and that we will continue to evaluate those options moving forward. And with that, I think we can go to the next slide. Again, emphasizing the public interest criteria, we do want to note that the WEIM charter would be updated to embed in its responsibilities and mandate the principle of respect for the public interest and for individual state policies for all customers in the footprint. This was a really important factor for many of the launch committee members and many of our stakeholders, that this public interest nexus was going to be the principle for our governance reforms, and to be really embedded in the decision-making of any governing body, regardless of the nature of their appointment or what criteria they were overseeing. So this is something we really have emphasized through our materials and our decision-making, and we have additional information about this in our Appendix E of the Launch Committee red line. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about how we moved from the December proposal to our April proposal, we really emphasized getting the feedback from stakeholders that we received in January. That helped us to narrow the options to focus on the most viable options in consistent alignment with the evaluation criteria. We are also able to hire Perkins Coie to conduct the legal analysis after we were able to form, an opportunity to collect revenue and or donations from our stakeholders. And then we've had a number of meetings. We've done a lot of engagement and outreach to educate ourselves with FERC. We appreciate CAISO staff's engagement as advisor. We sought their advice and formed an advice letter with CAISO staff. And we've also reached out across many of the other connections that we have through the East to understand more about the different RTO structures and how governance works in many of the different organized markets around the country. We have also engaged in several full-day in-person and virtual launch committee meetings. We met first in December in Sacramento. We also met in February virtually due to some weather delays and challenges with the February storms. And then we were able to meet in March in Phoenix, which was selected because Phoenix has very lovely weather in March after our kind of snafu with February. And these in-person meetings allowed us to really come together as a launch committee and get into some of the nuances of the decisions that we were making, and to really talk through where the recommendations, how the recommendations were evolving, make sure that we got full launch committee support and that we were evaluating our evolution consistent with the evaluation criteria, and to ensure that all launch committee members had a real voice in the progression of our scoping work. With the next slide, I think I will turn it over to our founding regulator members to hear from them and get their perspective on our work so far and the path forward. I think, Kevin, you were going to go first, and then Alice.
Oh, I was. I thought President Reynolds and I were going to do rock, paper, scissors. No, but I'd be happy to. Well, thank you, Kathleen and Pam, for kicking this off. And it's been a pleasure watching this grow. This came from an idea, from a concept. And as you stated earlier, Kathleen, back in July, we put this letter together and it's grown exponentially and into this robust conversation with multiple stakeholders across industry, across states, anything from utilities to advocacies to everything in between. And it's fun watching it grow and develop. And it's pretty impressive how this body works together and how they're maneuvering through the minutia and the issues that the states, the state regulators have put together, the criteria. And so I can't thank all of you enough for how you've gone. And I'll turn it over to President Reynolds.
Great, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Kathleen and Pam. This is an exciting day, at least I'm excited about it. The concept is really, really impressive. And as Kevin noted, the regulators got together and put forward the skeleton of a concept. And I have just been so pleased and just have so much gratitude to the launch committee for making it real and really fleshing it out, being very thoughtful and deliberative. And Pam referenced rolling up sleeves and putting heads down to do work. And that is exactly what happened here. Every single member of the launch committee representing all of the sectors has contributed to this process. And what has come out is very impressive, and I think really a momentous step forward. And I think, one thing I want to emphasize also, just to reflect on Kevin's comments, the other benefit that we've seen is the regulators have gotten together and had a chance to appreciate how we all are working towards the public interest of our customers within our states, but also that the region-wide collaboration benefits everyone. And so we're looking at this process as a way to really capture and build on customer benefits in cost containment and in reliability. And we see of the work of the launch committee as really a way to bring those things forward. Pam mentioned public interest emphasis in the proposals. And I see that very clearly in what's being put forward. And I think that, as she said, that's an important piece of this and something that can really be achieved as the process moves forward. I also wanted to note, from what I've observed, the process has been incredibly inclusive and in, I think, an unprecedented way, with every state with wide sectorial representation, really strong participation across the board. And that's what we need for success, that collaboration, the precise work, and really focusing on details, thoughtful deliberation. And everyone has come into this process being very solution oriented. So I think that has helped to get through some of the tricky issues where, there was something that looked like, wait, what are we going to do about this? And everybody came forward with a mindset of finding solutions. And I think that that's what you'll see in the proposals that are being put forward. I'm looking forward to hearing comments. I think that this is, an important part of the process, that this is now being put forward to get comments from a larger group of folks beyond the launch committee. So that's something that will be a very important part of the process. And I also wanted to note that this comes at exactly the right time. Customers throughout the West are seeing increased cost pressures. And we're seeing growing loads, and we're seeing uncertain weather events and increasing high heat events. So just lots of enthusiasm from me and excitement. And I just am happy to have the chance to express that. So I appreciate the time to make a few comments, Kathleen and Pam. And with that, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you both. I think it's significant that we've, just to sort of echo that, this is a diverse set of interests with very different priorities, and we have been able to, through some hard conversations, but keep moving in a direction that we are all still in agreement on, still working towards the goals that the regulators put out at the get-go. So thank you for setting this pathway on a good path, if you will. I'm going to need a thesaurus at the end of this to find different words for these things, but it has been an adventure, and it has been hard and incredibly rewarding thus far in the work that we're doing. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Evelyn Call to really get us going into the proposal, and we're going to start with the legal analysis, and then we'll jump into the individual steps. So Evie.
Thank you, Kathleen, and good morning. And I apologize in advance if my voice gives out. Allergies are pretty serious this morning. So, but today we're going to walk through a high-level review of the legal analysis that was provided by Perkins Coie at the Lunch Committee's request. And spoiler alert here, any of you who are lawyers or have worked with lawyers know that there aren't any simple or straightforward answers to legal questions. So we'll talk through that. But before we dive into the legal analysis, I wanted to set the questions, the legal questions, in the context of prior runs at regionalization in California. I think it's important to understand the differences we're talking about. When we've talked about regionalization in the past, and Mark Joseph will probably address this as well, the discussion was different in at least two different ways. First, the role we expected the CAISO to play was different, and the scope of services we thought would be regionalized was different. The prior efforts contemplated that the CAISO was going to be the regional organization, with other Western BAs participating in their market services. And today we're looking at a very different question. We're leaving the CAISO appointed, or the California appointed CAISO board intact, and instead looking to create a new and separate regional entity with independent governance authority. And the CAISO BA can choose to participate in that regional organization. So a critical difference from a legal standpoint is that there may be no change in law necessary to stand up a new regional organization. That could be done, outside of California law. But the key here is, if authority is required, it's required to ensure that the CAISO BA can participate in this new regional organization's markets. And I think that's an outcome that's highly desirable from a footprint standpoint in maximizing the benefits to the West. And the other key difference, as I mentioned, is that we contemplated going to a full RTO, whole hog. And this initiative looks at a more incremental approach to regional coordination. So these key differences, I think, give the discussion of legal boundaries and legislation an entirely different tenor. So with these differences in mind, let's turn to the legal analysis that was performed by Perkins Coie. Maybe go back one there, Kathleen, thanks. So what we asked them to do is to evaluate, under existing California law and FERC precedent, the options that we identified in our December 15th white paper, and we added another one along the way, which is option 2.5. Recall that each of these options focused primarily on creating independent governance for Western energy markets. We weren't looking at transmission planning or transmission operation or any other of the functions. And stakeholders made it clear in early comments that the issues of California law were most pressing, so we made it a priority. And in particular, Public Utilities Code 345.5 requires the CAISO to manage energy markets consistent with certain elements of the public interest. And California Corporations Code Section 5210 requires that the activities and affairs of the CAISO will be managed, and all corporate powers will be exercised under the ultimate direction of the board. So that's kind of the California constraint we were working within. At the time we asked for the analysis, we were short on details. And indeed, I think we're still struggling with some of those details. And for that reason, we worked with Perkins Coie on a risk-based approach. So not thumbs up or thumbs down on that approach, but what are the relative risks that we're seeing if we go forward with these structures without a change in law? And I think the simplest expression of Perkins' conclusions can be found at the bottom of the table attached to their legal analysis. So next slide, Kathleen. And if you can see at the very bottom there, it shows for both California law and FERC precedent, the general degree of risk that each option presents in a kind of stoplight or heat map format. And their narrative provides a more detailed discussion, but this gives you a quick uptake of what those risks look like. And I wanted to offer 3 key observations from their analysis. First, moving from the current joint authority structure for the WEIM governing body to a primary authority structure, which you see in option 0 over market decisions, didn't raise red flags for California law or FERC precedent. You can see that option 0 is fully green. And second, the red flags appear under California law as we move to a place where we're giving either the WEIM governing body or a new regional organization sole authority. And that, you know, may have different meanings, but as we move up the ladder in pushing the CAISO's authority over to the RO, we start to see some legal risk arise. And then finally, challenge also arise under FERC authority in a couple of the options. And as Perkins explained it, you know, it's, if you look at it, it's yellow, it's light yellow. But the tentativeness arises because there really aren't any precedents for delegating or transferring sole decision-making authority and Section 205 filing rights over the tariff rules governing an RTO or an ISO's entire energy market to a separate legal entity. The launch committees used Perkins' guidance in thinking about how to move incrementally toward greater regional coordination without creating unnecessary or untimely legal issues. And I think it's allowed us to do 2 things. One, we've gained a lot of comfort that our proposed step 1, which I'll be talking about shortly, will stay within the bounds of existing law. I think there's very little risk there of violating California law or FERC precedent. And second, it's also helping us shape and consider the nature of any legislation that might be required as we move into a step 2 design. And Spencer will talk about that in much greater detail. So with that, next slide, Kathleen. Before we, next slide. Before we discuss the step 1 proposal that really is supported by our legal analysis, I thought we could kind of level set on the current CAISO governance structure to better understand the baseline that we'll be coming from and making changes. And, you know, forgive me if you all already know this, but I thought we would at least level set. So the CAISO today is a 501c3 corporation at the top there in the blue box. And they operate with a board of governors. And the key factor is that board of governors is appointed by the governor of California. And all of the activities under the CAISO board are thus under Section 5210 under the ultimate direction of that board. To bring more independence to governance of the energy markets and entice more entities into the EIM, the CAISO modified its governance to include, if you go down a little bit, that the green box with the red circle around it, they incorporated an independent WEIM governing body. The governing body is a chartered body. It's not a legal entity like the CAISO, but today it shares joint authority with the CAISO board over market rules that apply to WEIM or soon to be EDAM entities in their role as those entities. Ultimately, though, we still have a structure where the CAISO must control the ultimate direction of market activity. And the WEIM governing body has no Section 205 filing rights at FERC. So only the CAISO can file proposed tariffs with FERC. So that's our starting point here in trying to develop our step 1 and step 2 solutions. Next slide. So I'll briefly touch on our stepwise approach, although I know we've talked about that before with this group. So again, you know, instead of going from 0 to 60 immediately into a full RTO, we've been talking about how to go there more gradually in a more realistic pace, both politically and functionally. So we've created this stepwise or incremental approach with 2 or maybe 3 steps. The first step is to increase the WEIM and EDAM governing board authority over existing markets. And I'll talk a little bit about step 1 here very shortly. Step 2, the next step up, we create a new independent regional organization to govern energy markets. And there are different ways of doing that. And Spencer will dive into the questions that we're grappling with there. It's a little bit harder. And step 3 would continue to expand on the work done in step 2 to increase the scope of regionalized functions and services that the RO could offer. And while step 3 isn't technically within the scope of the launch committee's work right now, we've given a good deal of thought to that question. And I'll credit Spencer for diving deep into this issue and doing a lot of hard work on it. And he explored the expanded services to ensure that what we adopt for step 2 will allow us to move toward a more mature step 2 or step 3. So that's the general approach that we've taken, our stepwise approach. Next slide. So then the step 1 is what I'm going to talk about now. And that is, again, it's the step that increases the independence and authority of the WEIM and EDAM governing body over the existing CAISO energy markets without the formation of a new regional organization. And I think Scott will talk a little bit about why this was such an important step, but it may look like a minor tweak of the existing structure, but it's really a meaningful move toward independent governance. And it does that in a way that minimizes risk under California law. If you remember going back to the heat map, this option that we are proposing for step 1 is green and green. There's really no risk under California law and no risk under FERC precedent. So today, the WEIM governing body, which is the chartered body within the CAISO, shares joint authority in market decisions. What step 1 does is increases this joint authority to primary authority. And it increases this within the same scope that we use today for joint authority. So today, when we say what matters are within joint authority, we ask the question, does it apply to WEIM or EDAM participants in their role as participants? And if it does, it's a matter within joint authority. And today, both bodies vote on new measures, and there's a dispute resolution prescribed in the governing body's charter. Only the CAISO, however, ultimately controls what is filed at FERC. And again, the WEIM governing body has no 205 filing rights. What's different here in shifting from joint to primary authority is that, at least initially, only the WEIM governing body would be voting to approve new measures, and they would go directly to the consent agenda of the CAISO Board of Governors. The Board of Governors can then pass it directly off to FERC and say, thumbs up, we have no issue with this, and it would go off to FERC for approval. Or if there was a disagreement, it would fall then into the existing dispute resolution process that we have today in the governing body's charter. And the key difference here, and that's the lower right-hand side, it's the blue box with the red circle around it, is if the two were unable to resolve their differences, and it's my understanding that really today even the WEIM governing body and the Board of Governors don't really run into disputes. But if that were to happen, what would happen is that the CAISO would be obliged to use its Section 205 rights to file both its preferred proposal and the WEIM governing body's preferred proposal. And it would be up to FERC to decide between them. So, you refer to this as the jump ball proposal or a dual filing proposal, but the proposals would go to FERC co-equal with no preference expressed. And the only circumstance in which the CAISO could break this circuit is if it's facing a time-critical exigent circumstance that really prevents them from going through, the full dispute resolution process and waiting to resolve things. So that is the primary change that's taking place in step 1. And I think, as Scott will discuss, it's a really important step. Another aspect, next slide, Kathleen, is the trigger. So to ensure that the step one actually does something for us before we do go ahead and change the governance structure, we wanted to be sure that step one actually leads to expansion of the WEIM and EDAM footprint. And so it requires that the governance changes go into place only after a trigger has been met. And as it says over there on the left, the step one governance transition is triggered when a set of geographically diverse non-CAISO entities equal to greater than 70% of the CAISO BA annual load for 2022 have executed the agreements, the EDAM implementation agreements. At that point, the new governance rules will be filed at FERC and triggered within WEIM and EDAM. So, I mean, what that translates to, there are different ways of looking at it, but at a minimum, what you're going to see is in the total EDAM market, you'd have roughly 45% load outside of California or 50%, 55% of load in California. Depending on how you configure which entities are opting in and out, you could have a maximum where you see 60% of the load coming from outside of California and 40% inside. So again, it depends on the scenario you're playing with, but that's kind of the range of the outcomes that you might see. So that is step one, and I'll look forward to questions later, but at this point, I will pass it off to Spencer, I believe, for step two.
Let's start with Scott Miller, who's going to jump
right.
in first. Yeah. Thanks, Evie.
Thanks, Evie. And I do want to just say it's been great working with Evie and Spencer on this. And while everyone in the launch committee contributed to this, Spencer and Evie did an awful lot of work on this, and so hats off to them. But I do want to sort of say that I think there's a tendency to sort of focus in on the step two process of this without recognizing that step one carries an awful lot of significance in the accomplishment if we're able to accomplish this. And that is the primary responsibility in this regard. And we tested this out after talking with a number of people in the East about governance. And Spencer and I went to go speak to the folks in New England, where they have a somewhat similar arrangement between the ISO New England board and the NEPOOL organization of participants. And they have a situation where there is the ability for NEPOOL to have its own proposal reviewed. And when there's a disagreement on the proposal that involves both NEPOOL and ISO New England's board, which has 205 rights, that they will actually first try to resolve this dispute similar to the resolution process that's envisioned or is actually in process right now in California with the CAISO and EIM. But if that is not resolved, then they would do a dual filing at FERC. And when we talked with the folks in New England, because a number of us who had been involved, and I had when I was on FERC staff with regard to the New England process, it was interesting that almost all the participants in the New England process were very satisfied with this jump ball approach because on the one hand, it provided the opportunity for different viewpoints, and the regulatory risk that was involved in going to FERC to try to seek resolution on a possible jump ball before FERC tended to drive the two entities towards compromise such that they didn't want to get to that outcome. And I think that sets up the sort of dynamic that we can expect if we adopt step one as proposed. And we tested this in a very casual way with FERC staff that have experience in this regard. And of course, they gave us the caveats that they weren't speaking for FERC and they couldn't guarantee that what they were talking about would reflect an ultimate FERC decision. But it did in our at that point nascent discussions about a similar situation that to New England's, that were we to propose something similar to that, it seemed to fit in the boundaries of FERC precedent. And so that was the basis upon which we came back and helped to work through step one, and then as a precursor to the possibility of step two. But it was very, very helpful, and something that gave us a great deal of optimism that step one would provide an awful lot of benefit and make make it attractive to those who were concerned about having adequate representation in a process involving similar EDAM type market responsibilities. And so I think while we'll go on to discuss step two and the possibilities of step two reaching further into structures that feel more independent, I think it's important to recognize how critical step one is to get us and how much that changes the dynamic inside governance that from what currently exists in the status quo. But with that, let me not dwell too long on that, but let's, I guess we'll move on to Spencer to get into the details of step two.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks for, I agree with everything you just said, and thanks for underscoring the significance of step one. I'm Spencer Gray, the Executive Director of NIPSI, the Northwest and Intermountain Power Producers Coalition. Evie and I co-chaired the functions and scope work group during this phase one to come up with this straw proposal. So step two, one thing I want to note at the beginning here that I think I shared in a previous stakeholder call, we have benefited on the launch committee, and I think the West, frankly, has benefited from, in one sense, thinking through these issues here in 2024 to have more than 25 years of precedent across the country to understand what's worked well, what's not worked well. Many parts of governance have not worked well in other RTOs. So we have at least one advantage in being able to learn some of those lessons from other jurisdictions and try to apply some of that here. And it also, I think, gives us better confidence that Evie alluded to in the legal analysis about what's passed muster under the Federal Power Act, which is really the most relevant issue for a lot of step two. So the step two proposal that we've laid out in the straw proposal has 4 key elements, and I'll go through each of them here today. Each of these has a series of rabbit holes you can go deep down. So I will try to keep us from going too deep, but open to questions on any of this. And the straw proposal throughout identifies open issues in places that we're really hoping for stakeholder feedback to help guide us and to help brainstorm a little bit on some of these open issues. The 4 key elements of step two, as we've laid out, are creating a regional organization. We've dubbed this an RO. It is not an RTO. It could become a platform for an RTO, and we've tried hard to think through how it could be capable of that. But we've chosen that name deliberately, regional organization, to avoid that conflation. The second step is the passage of enabling legislation. I will touch on that briefly, and then some colleagues from California will cover that in more detail after I present. The third step is a transition from the primary authority decision-making model proposed in step one that Evie covered to sole authority of the RO in step two within the same integrated energy market tariff. Number 4 would be the creation of pathways for services beyond EDAM and EIM, with the RO as the governing entity at minimum and possibly the actual host entity of those services. That fourth element is something we spent a lot of time to identify fatal hurdles to offering those services, but we're not proposing a particular way to structure the governance of those services. We wanted to make sure we did the due diligence to see if they were possible in what we've laid out here. But of course, that requires a lot more thinking and stakeholder feedback going forward. So why don't we start on the creation of the RO on the next slide. So the launch committee is proposing here to establish a new nonprofit corporation outside of the CAISO, no longer a chartered body within the umbrella of the CAISO, to be essentially the successor organization of the Western EIM governing body. The corporation would have its own independent board. That's been our driving objective, to have an independently nominated and selected board outside of the current structure of how the CAISO board is proposed and confirmed by the California legislature. As a starting point, we think a strong place to start is the use of sector-based nominating committees that have been successful in the actual nomination of the EIM governing body, as well as the Western Power Pool board that was seated recently in a restructuring of the Power Pool. The Power Pool board process for the nominating committee was based on the nominating committee for the EIM governing body. Of course, there's been other experience in WEC, in Markets Plus, in ways to structure this, but we think it's a strong starting point, possibly with some refinements and improvements as well. The anticipated organizational size, we are imagining at least a skeletal organization to begin with, which would consist of a board, possibly an executive director, and a small number of counsel to advise the board on which market rules and changes to consider. We've had some discussion in the launch committee that perhaps 5 board members is too small for a true West-wide board to oversee energy market services and future services. We haven't offered a recommendation on this, but perhaps larger than the current number of 5 board members, which is the case for the both governing body and the CAISO Board of Governors. We have an open question that the straw proposal identifies. We don't have a recommendation yet about the details of the incorporation. Should it be a 501c3, a 4, a 6? The RTOs themselves are all organized differently, and each of them have a structure that may hit one of those points. Where should its primary place of business be? Which state should it be incorporated in? All important but open questions for us. Each of which also deserves some attention from corporate counsel to help advise us and help advise the region. The other open issues I would identify are the appropriate funding structure. The structure to fund the governing body today would be an obvious starting point. We've also detailed a few considerations about a potential transition from the current governing body to the RO. We haven't colored that in yet. We've been very clear internally that there needs to be a continued important role for state regulators. And we've discussed a little bit the equivalent of that for non-jurisdictional utilities as well, which I know has come up various times around RAP and other regional services in recent years. And so we're picturing a strong role for some version of the boss here, again, potentially with refinements going forward, advising and having input on what the RO does and the decisions of its board. And then finally, a really important open issue is what stakeholder processes would be involved under the new regional organization. In other forums, several of us have talked about this as the difference between big G governance, the selection of the board, the nature of Section 205 filing rights, and small G governance, which is more the lived experience day-to-day of most of us interacting with the CAISO and other market structures. This deserves a lot more attention. We've focused most of our attention on the big G governance structure for what we're putting forward in the straw proposal. But I just want to highlight this issue as something leaders within the launch committee are eager to engage with stakeholders to try to shape and possibly improve on stakeholdering under the RO. Step 2 here, the second element, I should say, for step 2 is enabling legislation. The legal analysis that you have in your hands from Perkins Coie identifies the barriers that Evie summarized to moving to sole authority over filing of market rules for the regional organization. The risk of violating those kind of basic corporate precepts are the reason that we've embedded here as the second element of step 2, having enabling legislation in California. What this slide shows is it's not a draft of legislation. It really shows what the outcome we think would be necessary to enable step 2 as I'm describing it. A narrowing of the scope of the CAISO's corporate responsibilities under current state law in California. The flip side of that would be the allowance for a transfer of some of those existing management responsibilities to the regional organization. And then finally, something that would be held back in that revision to its corporate responsibilities, the retention of the CAISO board today's ongoing corporate responsibility over the balancing authority function of the CAISO. And others will speak to why that retention of the BA function distinguishes our effort from prior efforts, and why that's important in California and important in creating a greater sense of parity for the CAISO BA to participate in what the RO would oversee, in a similar way to how balancing authorities outside of California retain that decision to participate or not. As I mentioned, other launch committee members are going to address the legislative dynamic itself and the process in more detail after I go through the structure of step 2. And the general outcomes that I've outlined here and that are described in the legal analysis, they don't presume any particular way to draft a bill or consider a bill. That's, of course, the prerogative of the legislature and the prerogative of any legislature. I do want to mention a few things that can happen without legislation passing. A regional organization can be created, it can be incorporated, a board could be seated without enabling legislation. The authority in step 1 that would rest with the EIM governing body could be vested in a separately incorporated regional organization. There's not a barrier we've identified to that happening. And the RO could host other services that are not affected by state law. I'll touch on this later, but there are a couple examples of that the CAISO currently hosts. So in the absence of legislation, I don't think it's accurate to describe our situation as sort of a dead end. There are several important things that could happen around an RO in the absence of that. Let's go to the next slide. So this is really the heart of step 2 in terms of the shift in authority to sole authority over decisions about the content of market rules for EIM and EDAM. The launch committees thought a lot about where should we sort of hang our hats on for what achieving a durable governance structure that achieves the regulator's vision from last summer and provides really complete independence in terms of governance authority over the market rules. And this is what we've landed on, is sole, which means unilateral and exclusive authority in a section 205 sense to compel a filing or to make a filing yourself. We don't see a distinction between those two at FERC to determine the market rules themselves. In our general view, this is the single most important measure of independent authority over the energy markets. It's not the only way to measure independence. I already mentioned small g governance, and stakeholdering is an important issue as well. And it is bounded by several factors. But I just want to underscore this has been really the guiding objective for the committee in proposing step 2 here. The first question we've had to address in terms of, well, what is the scope of the sole authority is related to the decisional classification about market rule changes considered by the governing body and the board today. The current use of a functional test, the apply to test, for figuring out which matters under the current CAISO tariff fall under the joint authority of the EIM governing body. We've thought through this, and this is something the GRC, the Governance Review Committee, spent a lot of time on. The functional test, the apply to test, is strong in a number of ways. It is clear, it allows sort of fulsome stakeholder debate and governing body and board debate about which matters fall under the authority of the board versus the governing body. We think retaining that in some form is a really important incremental way to grow governance here. So that's what we're starting with. There are some matters that the apply to test, which limits application of the governing body's authority to matters that are solely related to the CAISO's balancing authority area or the CAISO controlled grid. Those fall outside of the joint authority of the governing body today. But there are matters that apply partially to both the controlled grid and to the balancing authority area. And so we've sketched out about 1,500 subsections of the tariff. That's 2 levels below the section headings of the tariff. And you can go even deeper than that to try to think through the exercise of, well, what applies only partially versus solely to the balancing authority area in particular, because that is the main thing that the CAISO board would be retaining corporate responsibility over. And we haven't completed that analysis. We anticipate that the vast majority of what falls under joint authority today, what would fall under primary authority in step 1, would fall under sole authority in step 2. But there's an important asterisk that there are some issues that haven't arisen under the current apply to test that need to be evaluated further that might remain under primary authority of the RO. The second set of issues that may be somewhat easier to work through are more generic provisions that apply across the board to both the energy markets and to the controlled grid and the balancing authority area. One example we gave in the straw proposal is dispute resolution mechanisms for contract disputes with the CAISO. It's possible those could be split out in the application of the apply to test, but again, we need to have a further analysis of the tariff sections with help from stakeholders to think through the scope of sole authority. I mentioned the issue of the bounds of sole authority in whatever form of contract is entered into between the CAISO and the RO. There need to be some forms of corporate protections for the CAISO itself. What that means is not an opportunity for the CAISO board to second guess policy decisions by the RO board in terms of policy. What it means is the CAISO couldn't be unilaterally exposed to, for example, a direction from the RO to break the law, to run the system in a physically infeasible way, to suddenly incur large financial obligations overnight. Those are the types of things that would create real corporate jeopardy for the CAISO as a market operator under whatever form of contract we sign. And so they would need to be spelled out and the CAISO protected in those regards. This third element does require changes to the CAISO bylaws and to the tariff. So we want to underscore that this would need to go in front of FERC ultimately for approval. And then the final point I want to mention on this slide is we had some discussion in the launch committee about the merits or drawbacks of maintaining a single integrated tariff. There's a version of what we've proposed, and option 3 in our December paper laid this out, that would have a completely separated tariff that the RO would file at FERC and administer. In our view, it makes more sense to maintain, on balance, a single integrated tariff for a number of reasons. The FERC precedents we've examined indicate that it is entirely feasible to have sole and exclusive 205 rights nested within the same tariff and held by multiple parties. The strongest precedent for that are transmission revenue requirements held by transmission owners and other RTOs. The advantages of maintaining the single tariff are lower administrative startup costs, avoiding the practical challenge of pulling apart the entire tariff, an easier time applying the functional apply to test in some form, probably a shorter implementation timeframe to get to complete independence here in step 2, and an important consideration for EDAM and EIM entities, seamless continuity for the governance of EIM and EDAM to avoid having to file an entirely separate new tariff. So we're happy to take feedback on this point from stakeholders, but where we've landed at the moment is to propose maintaining a single integrated tariff. Go to the next slide. The primary open issue in step 2 facing the committee, and we've highlighted this in the straw proposal, is whether to propose option 2 or what we've now labeled option 2.5 in the straw proposal. I will first mention what's the same between both of these options for step 2. They both involve the creation of a new nonprofit corporation, the RO. They both would have sole authority over market design and decision-making and stakeholder processes. Both would have some limited number of corporate protections for the CAISO that I mentioned. The CAISO would maintain responsibility as the ministerial administrator of the tariff itself. The CAISO would have responsibility for market operations subject to the RO's sole governance authority. And in both cases, there would be a contract that would govern the relationship between the CAISO and the RO. The primary way that these two options are different is option 2 really focuses on governance independence in creating a board and some minimal support for a board to oversee the market rules. Option 2.5 has more elements of institutional independence. The RO would be the outward-facing entity that would actually offer market services to entities that would take that service. And that outward-facing responsibility comes along with requirements for liability and protecting exposure to liability that the CAISO currently has today. So really the question here turns on what is the form of the contractual relationship between the two entities, and how much of the institutional elements of the CAISO would the RO need to take on in order to perform, to have a contract for services with the CAISO in which the CAISO is more like a vendor and less like the outward service offer of the energy markets. This has involved us in looking at sort of 3 related areas that are challenges that require further evaluation. The first is about financial liability. The second is about how the RO would be staffed. And the third is about existing contracts. So I'll cover each of those, turn to some diagrams that show option 2 and 2.5, and we'll wrap up shortly after that. This shows the relationship between the RO and the CAISO in option 2, which is more of an interface agreement. The RO has a more skeletal approach of overseeing the energy market rules itself. You can see the EDAM entities described, EIM entities and EDAM entities that are potential entities described at the bottom there, retaining sole authority over grid operations and their BA function. And the CAISO similarly retaining that authority at the beginning of step 2. The next slide shows option 2.5, so I'll highlight the difference there. This shows a contract for services instead of an interface contract, in which the CAISO is in the mode of a vendor, and it requires additional institutional independence by the RO is our expectation. The 3 issues I mentioned that we're evaluating further: financial liability. The CAISO has had about $260 million of operating expenses in 2022. It had reserves for operating reserves, about 15% of that O&M budget, about $30 million of an operating reserve. It had a debt service reserve and a capital reserve. It had bond issuing capacity. It continues to have that. Market participants post collateral that protects the CAISO itself from exposure to defaults in the market. And the CAISO has a lien on market revenue that at the moment, the approximately $200 million grid management charge compares to about $5 billion of market settlement collections. So that's an over 20-to-1 coverage ratio for what the CAISO has as an operating expense each year. Each of those is something we need to consider if the RO would need to have in some form in option 2.5. And we provide those kind of gross numbers to explain the level of institutional independence that might be required. The lien on market revenue we've emphasized in the straw proposal is something we'd appreciate additional stakeholder feedback on, if that would be an appropriate place for us to think about a way to protect the RO's exposure to financial liability. The second complicating issue that I mentioned in the previous slide was staffing for the RO. I'll provide 2 bookends, and we're looking for feedback on this. In the case of NEPOOL, the stakeholder committee in New England, They have an annual budget of about $7 million that covers 11 outside attorneys, 2 administrative staff, a few consultants, and a lot of stakeholdering process. That seemed like maybe a fair starting point for considering what a more skeletal version of the RO would be. The opposite bookend would be closer to really the option 3 or 4 that we laid out in December, that approximates something like half of what the CAISO does today. So that could be dozens of staff, that could be annual expenses in the neighborhood of $100 million if we had a full spin-off of market services. We understand how important comparing administrative costs are for whatever we propose here as a final proposal in the beginning of the summer. And so we're really looking for feedback from stakeholders on which of those various options between those bookends makes the most sense for stakeholders for considering step 2. We've also looked a little bit at the separation of staff that the Department of Market Monitoring has within the CAISO today, the structure of RC West within the CAISO, and the way that quasi-judicial administrative agencies have firewalls for administrative law judges and that type of staff to think through the staffing structure for the RO. The final complicating issue that I mentioned was existing contracts. We really need some additional analysis about the approximately 3 dozen types of regulatory contracts that exist between the CAISO and counterparties today. We have not concluded that the existence of the existing contracts renders option 2.5 infeasible, but it may be a complicating factor if changing the outward-facing entity in step 2 affects those contracts, because it may affect the counterparty in the contracts. So I think I'll move on to the final element here of step 2. And I spoke to this briefly at the beginning. This is the creation of new pathways beyond EDAM and EIM. Essentially, this is a question of, is the RO RTO capable? In the straw proposal, I'm not going to go through these even in a list, but we identified about 7 different ways that services could migrate over to the RO from the CAISO, or could be offered anew by the CAISO itself. I think the important point to underscore is we have not identified any fatal hurdle to becoming RTO capable in the governance structure we've laid out. What stakeholders should anticipate is the step 2 structure, either option 2 or 2.5, could replicate the transition of energy market governance for other services to the RO over time. And so you could anticipate an end state where there is some mixture of sole, joint, primary authority held by the RO over a suite of services beyond the energy markets. And one thing this would really allow, and seems like something the West has embraced, is incrementalism. As new entities indicate that they want new services beyond the energy markets, and once there's a critical mass of those entities, the structure we've set up here with this mixture of sole and joint authority would truly enable that. I think I'll wrap up there, and if we have particular questions on these other services, I'm happy to take those a little bit later.
Thanks, Spencer. Really appreciate it. And with that, we are seeing the questions come up, so thank you for putting those in there. We will get to those. We'll start with those in the chat and then call on folks as we move forward after we get through what makes this different and sort of the legislative path. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark Joseph.
Thanks. My name is Mark Joseph. I'm a member of the launch committee representing the IBEW in California. I'm going to talk about the politics of what needs to happen so that California can participate in markets overseen by the new RO. As you all know, 3 times California considered regionalization legislation. 3 times we and others opposed that legislation. And 3 times California declined to pass that legislation. So many people outside of California ask me, so what's different this time? Or more pointedly, they ask, why should we expect any different result this time? So first, look at the roster of the launch committee. It's fair to say that among the leading opponents in the past were the IBEW and the publicly owned utilities in California. Now, Randy Howard, Jim Chetler, and I are on the launch committee and spending lots and lots of time and effort to craft a proposal that will succeed. Frankly, I wouldn't be spending this much time if I thought this was going to crash and burn. Second, and more substantively, as Evie outlined, the Pathways proposal is completely and fundamentally different from the previous regionalization efforts that were considered by the California legislature. They're different in both structure and in detail. All the prior proposals would have the governance of the CAISO removed and replaced with an independent board not connected in any way to the state of California. The CAISO would become the RTO for the West. The CAISO would be the RTO. All the prior proposals would have resulted in tens of thousands of California jobs lost. Now, California legislators were asked to simply give up their only hook over the independent system operator, which is confirming the appointment of the Board of Governors, and were asked to take on faith that what replaced the current system would be good for California ratepayers, would protect California policy, would preserve the incentives under our RPS law to build new generation in California and create California jobs. The ISO would have been transformed from a California-based operator with limited control by state government to being the regional operator for the entire West with no control by state government. But there was no plan to make this happen. There were no details about what the new system would look like, and no way for California legislators to have any idea what would actually happen. Yet they were being asked to give up their only control over the ISO, confirming the board, and simply hope for the best. Not only was there no detailed plan of what the future would look like, but there were absolutely no guarantees that the interests of consumers in California or policymakers would be protected. All they knew for sure is that a vote in favor of one of those bills in the past would have been the last vote they would ever take on anything regarding the CAISO. Given that proposal, the proposals we saw in the past, it's not at all surprising that California legislators declined to close their eyes, hold hands, and jump off the cliff. It would have been foolish to vote out those bills, and we told them so. In contrast, under the Pathways proposal that Evie and Spencer have laid out in some detail, there would be a completely different structure, and we will know the details. The CAISO would remain intact. The CAISO balancing authority area would remain intact. The incentives to create jobs in California would remain intact. And the thing that changes is the governance just of the market functions now currently housed within the CAISO, with the door left open for more incremental changes in the future. The CAISO would simply be one of, hopefully, many participants in the real-time and day-ahead markets, along with utilities and balancing authorities from inside and outside of California. Moreover, the new governing body controlling the rules of the market would have as part of its charter to protect the interests of consumers and ensure that the public policy interests of each state would continue to be protected for the consumers of that state. So, the Pathways proposal is entirely different, both in structure and in detail. I expect that after step 2 is more fully fleshed out, we will be able to go back to the legislature and show both that there will be substantial economic benefits to California consumers, that California jobs will continue to flourish, obviously our number one concern. And at the same time, California policymakers will continue to be able to implement California public policy interests for California consumers, not for anyone else, but for California consumers. That will be a very different bill for the California legislature to consider. Very different than any of the three prior bills. It would look nothing like the bills that previously did not pass. Now, obviously, I can't speak for the California legislature, but given the fundamental differences in both structure and detail and the demonstrated benefits for California consumers and for workers, and a design to preserve California policy for California consumers, I think there's every reason to think that the outcome can be different. Now I think I pass it to Randy Howard.
Thank you, Mark. My name's Randy Howard. I'm the general manager at Northern California Power Agency. And as Mark pointed out, we were one of the larger group that had opposed some of the previous efforts for some of the reasons that Mark had laid out. And I would just like to add what's different now too, from our perspective, is one, we have a lot of success, and it's measured success in the energy imbalance market today. We like what we see in the day-ahead market, but we know overall market conditions have changed dramatically through the West in the last couple of years, and we see that change continuing. And so the do-nothing strategy or staying as we are today doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think the framework that's been put forward that you're looking at today solves a lot of those issues for many of us. Can we go to the next slide? So what I'm going to speak to is really what is that legislative process? What does it take? So there's already been an effort to get out and have some informational sessions with some key legislative staff personnel, walk through what we've been working on, why it is different, what are some of the key components of that. We see that continuing on as these details get fleshed out a little bit more, as well as feedback. Also, many of those same key staff have been invited to participate in the stakeholder process. They're on this call. I've seen a number of names on this call. So they're staying informed through a number of different ways, but we'll continue to reach out and be responsive to questions they have. So we haven't given them language. We're not in that phase yet, but really just trying to keep them informed of what is the process, who are the folks engaged, and how we're going to go about it. And we expect to have many more meetings along that line. So the language, though, and what Spencer went through in the step 2, where there is a need for a legislative change going forward. On this slide, we kind of talk about what is that process. So in the fall, we would be meeting with some legislators, just talking over the type of legislation we would need, a framework of what that might look like, and hopefully work on a draft language that one or more would introduce in January. So there'd be an introduction in either the Assembly or the Senate, and then that would go through a committee process, and a review process would be evaluated based on its fiscal impacts. And that's why Mark mentioned, they will look closely at what will be those impacts to California for proceeding with this. If that were to proceed, we then move to the other side of the House. So if it's introduced on the Assembly side, it would go to the Senate side. It goes through a similar process there where we would seek sponsors from the legislative. And then eventually around September, it would, if it was successful, would land on the governor's desk for signature. So that's the framework. Different than many other states in the West, we have a full-time legislative body in California. So these folks are working on these types of issues all along, thinking about them. And I agree kind of with Mark with the framework that's here and that we're proposing. I don't see a difficulty in moving this forward, but again, I can't speak for them. They will have that opportunity to vote. And while the launch committee itself won't be advocating, many of us individually that represent organizations will be working closely with the legislative body going forward. So with that, I think I turn it back to Kathleen.
Thanks, Randy. Really appreciate it. And with that, we will, I think, take some questions. I'm going to start with ones in the chat, and then if you have a question, please raise your hand. Maybe, Sarah, if we want to quit screen sharing for a second, that might make this a little easier. But I will start with some of the questions, and I will open this up for other Pathways Launch Committee members to answer as well. But I think on Doug, on your question about whether or not the Launch Committee envisions the EIM governing body and the CAISO Board of Governors continue to have joint meetings. This is something that we've discussed, but we haven't really prescribed. So we expect we'll get some discussion among the stakeholders and between those two governing bodies. So haven't come up with a recommendation on this at this point. Let me know if you have any follow-up on that, Doug. Kathleen, thank you for your comment. This is the GRC's work, previous work has really been incredibly informative into the work that we've done. So this is something that we have really been trying to incorporate into the analysis, the negotiations, the discussion, and ultimately into these proposals. Question, the presentations from Yvonne, the presentations so far have talked about possible legislation needed to address CAISO and California issues. Does the proposal also relate to potentially needed legislative changes in the other states that would participate? At this point, and I will let others weigh in if there's more to add, we don't see any other needed legislative change in other states to enable this to happen. So at this point, California is the only one that where we're having a conversation about potential legislative change. I think we will be posting all the materials as well as a recording of this meeting. Moving on to Bonnie, if a dual filing is submitted in a neutral fashion, is it anticipated that there would be a process for both the governing body and the Board of Governors respectively to explain to FERC their differing views on the competing approaches that were submitted? And I might look to one of my colleagues to address that one.
I'll jump in, but I think Spencer could as well. Had this discussion last week with FERC commissioners and their key staff as to their comfort level on that jump ball process, what happens in New England, and how comfortable they are if we were to look at a similar approach. And there was great comfort, Bonnie, in that approach. And I think it is looked at the way that you've laid it out. They would view both proposals, and I think Spencer indicated clearly try to get the parties to work together to come up with a common approach in the end, but they were very comfortable with and supportive of the approach being proposed. But Spencer probably can add to that.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, Bonnie, it's I think the important point is the proposals wouldn't be put forward with a preference for either one indicated to FERC, but it wouldn't be a mystery to FERC why the board versus the governing body preferred their respective proposal, but they wouldn't come in the door with a preference indicated that FERC should presume.
Thanks, guys. Mike, why wait till 2025 to run a bill in California? There's plenty of time left in this year's session. I'm going to defer to my California colleagues. Who wants to? Evie.
Yeah. Can I take it because I feel strongly about this one?
Yes, please.
Mike, I think there have been challenges in the past at the legislature. We all know that. And most importantly, we haven't finished figuring out step 2, and we really want to land step 2 before we try to articulate what we need in legislation. And I don't think we're going to complete our vision of step 2 probably until the beginning of September, which leaves us no time. So I think we want to do this right. We don't want to rush it, and we want to know what we have in mind before we ask for it.
Thanks, Evie. Other questions? I am taking this as an indication that we covered very thoroughly the proposal.
Sorry, I have one question, but I can't figure out how to raise my hand. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries,
just one question on the timing that you, way back at the beginning, talked about the triggers for implementing step 1. And I'm curious if there's a particular goal obviously it takes time to get, there's kind of a stagger with entities committing to EDM and then signing implementation agreements. And I was interested in thoughts on whether there's a goal to try to have this done before go live, like how to respond, I guess trying to balance any goals and intent with regards to having step one in place before go live relative to the lag in entities committing.
So Kathleen, did you want to repeat?
No, go ahead.
So when we think about this, the next step for step one is going to be to go to the CAISO stakeholder process. And you probably saw that on the big summarized or the roll up of the Gantt chart. So that's going to go to the CAISO to work out through the stakeholder process this year. We envision that we could have the necessary implementation agreements signed, possibly by the end of the year, which would enable this to go live when EDAM ultimately goes live. I mean, I don't think we can predict at this point who's going to sign when, but it could be as early as go live.
I mean, go live is for EDAM first quarter 2026. So I would imagine people would be making their commitments and selections probably well before that. And go live for Markets Plus is first quarter 2027. So yeah, we're in second quarter 2024 right now.
Allison, does that get you what you need?
It does, thank you.
Great. Doug, there are public votes shown in step one and step two. What are those? So when the launch committee put together its mission and charter, we committed to making our final votes on really these recommendations in public. And so when we get to a final recommendation on step one and step two, we will do a meeting like this where we are able to have a bit of a conversation and do a vote from the launch committee to finalize those recommendations in public. So that's what that's referring to. Any other questions on process, on the proposal? I will encourage you, if you do have additional questions before comments are due, you can submit them through the Pathways email address, which we can put here in the chat in a second. But please do reach out. And with that, I think maybe we'll move to next steps and then sort of what we want to see from you all. So I'm going to share my screen at this point. So next steps here, we have our public comment open until May 8th. Again, there's a comment specific email address to submit those comments. The launch committee will then take some time to incorporate the feedback and refine the proposals. We anticipate, depending on, of course, all of this is depending on the feedback that we get, that we will be, but in a sort of an ideal world, we'll be able to move forward with step one implementation over this summer, and then working towards a final recommendation for step two in late summer, early fall. The regional organization initiation, we put in our Gantt chart that we'd be aiming for kind of the end of this year. I think that too will kind of depend on the feedback that we get. It will also depend on some of the legislative conversations and process that we're evaluating at that point. So that may be something that moves a little bit, but certainly I think we want to make sure, as Mark and Randy mentioned, that we are bringing something to the legislature that has some structure around it so that they know what they are making changes to. And then ultimately, we will still be engaging with the legislature in California along the way and looking towards a potential bill in the 2025 legislative session. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Scott Miller to talk a little bit about what we need from stakeholders.
Thanks, Kathleen. And just to wrap this up, it is important as Spencer walked through a lot of these things where we're looking for guidance from or views from stakeholders to help move forward with the finalization of both the reaction to step one and which approach on step two we should be pushing on. We need that input from stakeholders. And written requests are, very, very useful for us in this regard. So what are we asking for stakeholders? Okay, in your packet, there are specific questions that are listed, but just to summarize, are there any concerns for step one as proposed? That is moving the governing body of the WEAM EDAM board from joint authority to primary authority. With regard to step two, governance or more institutional independence. Okay, so is the level of the step two and where the RO with the minimalist structure or staffing and around that, does that pose challenges for either your organization or the region? Similarly, with regard to the 2.5 approach to step two, which is more institutional independence that Spencer laid out in some detail in terms of what would be necessary to take on that additional level, that recognizing that may make some people feel better about the independence of the RO under those circumstances, but recognizing that there are some challenges and costs associated with that. So we're asking the same question for that approach to step two. Does that pose any challenges for your organization or for the region? Because again, while we are asking people to think about their needs, we're all sort of thinking about what's necessary for the region. So we'd also like to hear from people about unexplored options, ideas that perhaps we hadn't thought of that you would like to have considered in this process. We recognize that while this is a very broad launch committee of stakeholders, and we've tried to do some thoughtful analysis, we recognize that that this isn't the only place where good ideas can come from. And any other considerations that the launch committee should consider before we try to finalize recommendations for possible adoption. That's what we're asking for stakeholders, and we're really interested in some thoughtful comments, if you'll be so kind to provide them to us. So Kathleen, you want to take us home?
You bet. Thank you, Scott. I'll leave this up. This is the email address for submitting comments. I see a couple more questions in the chat and happy to address those. First one, assuming there's already ample coordination with CAISO staff, has CAISO confirmed that there is room in their initiative staff's calendar and to start work on the stakeholder process in 2024? Or would this be a policy roadmap initiative request for next year? Pam, did you want to take that?
Yes. So we are coordinating with CAISO staff on the initiative process. We do believe that we could make it through the stakeholder process in 2024. Since this is a public and open stakeholder process, and we will continue to take comment and host several more workshops, we think that there's an opportunity to tuck this process into a CAISO process or coordinate with CAISO in a meaningful way, and that could take place this year. As the second question around will Pathways get involved in SEAMS negotiations? I think Kathleen at the beginning noted that Pathways is not doing market design work. We see a SEAMS coordination as a market design issue. We will not be engaging in that effort.
Thanks, Pam. All right, last call for questions. All right. Thanks again to the entire launch committee. Thank you all for all your interest and support, and for cranking through almost an hour and 45 minutes of some pretty dense material. Again, please reach out, please submit comments. One other thing I wanted to mention, we have an updated roster and work group list that we've posted on the Pathways Initiative landing page on the WEEB website. So just trying to keep things updated and transparent. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Thanks, everyone.